Hello, welcome to this first adaptation webinar. We are very, very pleased to welcome you here for the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. Sorry for being a little late. We had some troubleshootings and I cannot use the video, but I am Christophe Buffet. I'm the program manager of Adaptation. Before introducing our panel today, let me say a few words about this program. Adaptation is led by the Agence française de développement and Expertise France to help 15 countries and regional organizations particularly vulnerable to climate change. 80 studies and capacity building activities are planned by November 2021. These supports are both related with traditional adaptation topics such as agriculture or water, but also we have the aim to foster innovation, emerging approaches or cross-cutting issues such as nature-based solutions, vertical integration of adaptation, education, gender, and social inclusion. Today's webinar is precisely about an innovative approach, forecast-based early actions. This webinar follows a study coordinated by Elodie Afonso, Regional Coordinator for Adaptation in the Caribbean, and conducted by ODI, the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, and RAMBLE for our partner, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. To share this study and to put this work into perspective with lessons learned in other regions, we have the pleasure to welcome Emily Wilkinson, Senior Research Fellow at Overseas Development Institute, and Irene Amoron, Technical Advisor and forecast-based financing at Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. The agenda will be the following. We'll have a short video first, and then 2 times 10 minutes of presentation from the speakers, followed by a Q&A session that will be co-animated with Elodie Afonso for 15 minutes. You will be able to ask questions. You are asked to ask questions, actually. To ask a question, please use the Q&A panel on the right side of the screen, and panelists will answer it either through the panel itself or at the end of the presentations during the Q&A session of 15 minutes. You can also vote for questions that seem the most relevant to you by clicking the arrow beside the question. That's it for the general framing of this webinar. Let's start quickly with a short video to understand the main principles of forecast-based early action in 4 minutes. Let me start the video.
Extreme weather events are becoming more intense in the Eastern Caribbean. Protecting people and property can stop climate extremes from turning into disasters. The good news is that there is much more that Eastern Caribbean nations can do to prepare before extreme weather events. Eastern Caribbean governments and regional institutions are already reducing disaster risk and investing in making infrastructure and societies more resilient. But some climate risks will always remain. Governments can plan ahead, so when extreme weather is forecast, plans are ready to go. This is how it works in practice. New types of impact-based forecasts can tell us what kind of weather to expect and also how people and places will be affected. These forecasts can provide information 2 or 3 days before the storm hits, further ahead in the case of heavy rainfall, heat, and drought. If the forecast shows that a predetermined threshold has been reached and a disaster is imminent, then decision makers trigger early action to target help exactly where it will be needed. For example, early action could involve keeping the public and business well informed, pre-positioning emergency supplies in places most likely to be affected, paying contractors to check and clear drains, distributing water, food, and equipment, and evacuating people from dangerous areas. In the case of droughts, information is available in time so that governments can extend social assistance programs and also support farmers to protect their animals and crops in advance. There are 4 key steps to developing a forecast-based early action system so it's ready to work effectively. 1. Assess how extreme weather might affect communities and businesses, and register people so that you can contact them and provide support when there's an alert. For this task, governments would benefit from collaborating with civil society groups and researchers to gather better information on the impacts of extreme weather events and who is most at risk and why. Decide the trigger points for early action based on temperatures, rainfall, storm surge or wind speeds, and the impacts that these hazards are expected to have on people, property, crops, and infrastructure. 2. Get detailed early action plans ready, which involve actions to reduce impacts and respond more quickly when there's a severe weather alert. 3. Stockpile and position supplies and equipment so they can be distributed quickly to emergency workers. Make agreements with contractors to release supplies when they are needed. Verify the list of people at risk and their bank details so they can receive emergency cash to take early action at home. 4. Line up funds for quick release to contractors and people at risk when the trigger is reached. Financing mechanisms are really key. National governments should hold reserve funds that can be released before small-scale emergencies. But for the major emergencies, governments may have to call on regional institutions and funds for support. With more coordination and early action of this kind, the Eastern Caribbean can reduce disaster losses and look forward to a more climate-resilient future. For more information on how to prepare for early action, please visit us online, odi.org.uk/Caribbean-forecast.
I think Christoph may be having some problems with his microphone, so I'll begin my presentation. Thanks very much to AFD and to Christoph for inviting me to speak in this webinar and for showing the animation which we've been working on for a number of weeks, which demonstrates how forecast-based early action could work in the Eastern Caribbean. But let me take a step back because I want to talk a bit more broadly about forecast-based early action and where the concept comes from, and provide a bit of context as to what kinds of initiatives we're seeing around the world to improve action, financing and use of forecasts before extreme weather events. So in its very broadest sense, forecast-based early action refers to actions that are triggered by a forecast of a shock. So specifically based on information in a forecast and ideally a forecast of impact as well. So we can see that the notion of forecast-based early action is really used in relation to forecasts of and in particular of extreme weather events. So it's really defined by this trigger that can be used to refer to very different kinds of actions, including livelihood protection, assistance to help to reduce risks and avoid impacts once a shock or a crisis is imminent, and also to be better prepared to respond after a disaster. So the actions can take place before a shock occurs or when or be completed after a shock. It's made possible by improvements in weather forecasts and vulnerability assessments, which make it a bit easier to take action early and to target it towards groups that are most likely to be affected. But one of the kind of, there are a number of key components of forecast-based early action that need to be set up in advance for it to work. And those include having forecasts and clear thresholds for action to be triggered, having detailed plans in place of what actions are going to be implemented, how those are going to be coordinated, who has responsibility for what. Prearranged and or reliable financing to pay, to fund some of these actions, and a delivery mechanism to get support to people who most need it. So we see forecast-based early action as critically having to have those four components in one form or another. So I'm going to talk about why forecast-based early action is innovative and important, and I'll take two perspectives on this and then try and kind of bring them together. So first is the humanitarian perspective, and that's looks at disaster response and years of responding to disasters as being often too late. So the resources arrive in communities that are affected by disaster after some of the impacts have been felt, and some of those impacts can be irreversible, and the consequences are already occurring. So there's been a really strong push from the humanitarian sector to do more earlier to avoid those impacts. There is some emerging evidence that that acting earlier is more cost effective and has cost benefits vis-a-vis acting later, and we can come back to that in our discussions later. There's experience in the humanitarian sector of understanding shocks and their impacts and the needs of vulnerable groups, and experience of delivering these forecast-based early action pilot projects, and there are many projects, probably over 50 now around the world, and experience of developing funding modalities to support those initiatives. But now the feeling is that there's really a need to scale up these initiatives and to fund them in other ways that don't rely purely on humanitarian finance. So that's this sort of humanitarian perspective on forecast-based early action and why it's needed. From a development perspective, it's a bit different. Governments are already investing in disaster risk reduction and resilience, climate adaptation, but there are many limitations to their ability to do that, and there are inevitably what we call residual risks, so risks that can't be reduced when there is when a shock is imminent. And so this is where forecast-based early action really fits. It's in addressing those residual risks. And there are a number of different things that governments can do to act early or to take this kind of forecast-based early action. They can provide information so people can take informed decisions themselves and act in advance of an event. They can heighten and target seasonal preparedness actions. So the kinds of preparedness that they were doing kind of earlier in the season, this can now be more scaled up and targeted at groups and places that are most likely to be affected. They can prepare and have resources ready to respond quickly after a disaster, and they can redirect resources from previously planned activities towards actions very focused on the imminent and predicted crisis. So this is an area for sectoral ministries to be thinking about and to be where they can really add value. So we can see that there is a rationale for forecast-based early action from a humanitarian and a development perspective, and these two now need to be sort of meshed. They need to be pulled together so that governments and development agencies can benefit from the skills and the experience that humanitarian agencies have with surveillance, with providing data on vulnerabilities, with developing these financing mechanisms, and the humanitarian and development sectors coming together to work on forecast-based early action would be extremely kind of beneficial. These initiatives are going to have to be carefully designed to avoid disincentivizing or crowding out longer-term investment in disaster risk reduction and adaptation. And so I've noted a few challenges ahead for this area of practice and for joint humanitarian development action. The first is around scaling up and considering and thinking very carefully about which impacts and which actions to reduce those impacts are most suitable for forecast-based early action. For some will work better than others. In which context is this going to work better? In contexts where there are strong institutions that can be built on, or in places where the institutions are really lacking and where there's perhaps greater need. And we need to consider the sustainability of finance, how these actions, ways of working, going to be supported over the long term. Another major challenge is, for now, that forecast-based early action is not a core component of national disaster risk management systems. There's limited buy-in from those agencies to date, but as I've mentioned, great potential for them to adopt this approach and work with humanitarian agencies on this agenda, and need for really a systems-wide change, focus on delivering relief earlier to a shared responsibility across government, development partners and humanitarian agencies to deliver more effective action before disasters have devastating impacts. So those are some of the challenges for this sort of this field of work. But as Irene is going to talk about, there's been some really important progress in this field. So I'll hand over to Irene for the next section.
Indeed, thank you, Emily. We have seen in your presentation that the very beginning of FBA process leans on forecasting. So, Irene Amaran, you're a technical advisor on forecast-based financing at the Red Crescent Climate Center. Can you tell us a little more about the current progress of forecasting?
Sure. Thank you so much, Christophe and Emily. Can somebody, am I able to move the presentation myself, or do I need help? Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Greetings from Uganda, and happy to be here. So I will speak generally in regards to the status of forecasting for floods and droughts in Africa, drawing on examples mainly with countries that we've been working on and working with towards developing forecast-based action systems. So generally, we do have very limited forecasting for drought and floods in Africa. What is mainly available is, of course, the weather and the climate forecast. So you'll have the daily weather forecast, the 10-day weather forecast, the seasonal forecast, and then, of course, the climate forecast. And particularly for drought, we usually rely mainly on the seasonal and or sub-seasonal forecast. And we also look at the integrated food security classification phase. On top of that, we would also look at proxy indicators, for example, prices of foodstuffs, of basic services that is directly linked to food security. And usually for the drought here, the biggest indicator for that is the effect on food security. So that is what we look at as one of the indicators of a pending drought, or we are going through a drought. And of course, we do have the FISNet alerts that are usually provided on a regular basis. Although these are not, FISNet is not available in all the countries, but at least it gives you an idea of what is happening within the regions. So, of course, within the seasonal forecast, we do provide, we do have information based on the rainfall deficits. It does not, for example, give you more than what you know. So, for example, what is the status of the vegetation, what is the status of the food crops and all that. So that has been one of the limitations of the seasonal forecast in regards to drought forecasting. However, it's also important to know that there's been some significant work that has been put towards improving drought forecasting, and I will share particularly from East Africa. There's been quite a strong collaboration between I'll pick up from an example of Kenya. There's been a very strong collaboration between the Kenya Meteorological Department with the universities of Sussex, University of Oxford, in terms of improving this forecast and also making the drought early warning systems more anticipatory than reactionary. So currently work is going on to develop drought forecasting, and we do have work that has been done through the TAMSAT alert, also in collaboration with the University reading. And also, of course, together with what is already going on, again, we do have the forecasts that are currently available will, of course, give you a general outlook for the season. But as you want information that is downscaled at a lower granular level, that is a challenge that is going on. But despite these challenges in the forecasting for drought, there has been some good collaborations between the humanitarian agencies, such as the Red Cross with the National Met Hydro Services at a regional and at national level. And currently within the East African region, we are having some good discussions and a potential for partnership within ICPAC, which is the IGAD Center for Predictions and Applications that is helping in terms of the forecasting. When we get to the to flood forecasting, so we did a very light touch assessment across Southern Africa, particularly from Zambia. We also had a brief assessment in Mali, in Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia, and our findings indicated that all these particular countries that I've mentioned do not actually have national flood forecasting models. So in the conversation that we've been having with the technical teams that involve the National Hydromet Services, the DRR government agencies, research institutions, humanitarian organizations, we've been discussing with the current limitations that we have. Given that countries, we do not have national flood forecasting systems, what do we do? So we explored options, and of course, we looked at what is currently available at no cost to the National Met, to the government, and that's how we've ended up using the Global Flood Awareness System currently. So this is what these countries will be using in addition to the rainfall forecast to be able to activate early actions once they've hit their thresholds. And then, of course, the regional World Meteorological Organizations are also supporting towards the transition to impact-based forecasting. But this is at various levels across the various regions. In East Africa, in West Africa, and Southern Africa, all these regional climate centers are at various levels. But what is important to note and what is encouraging is now there is a recognition to transition from just what the weather will be to what the weather will do. Of course, it's going to need a lot of investments from governments towards the infrastructure for forecasting, but at least the conversations are going on. And then also picking up from Uganda, there have been some efforts towards setting up a national flood forecasting center that will be helpful in terms of flood forecasting. And also there are other investments that are going on in other countries to try and see that countries are able to be prepared for extreme events and tapping onto the regional forecasts that are available as they build their national flood forecasting models and centers. I would also like to recognize that some countries are already doing some aspects of the impact-based forecasting. Particularly, I'll pick an example from Southern Africa where this is going on, and then there's been a good uptake also at community level in terms of contributing towards this process and planning for action in preparation for floods. And of course, moving forward, we all agree that the future of forecasting is towards impact-based forecasting. And we are looking at impact-based forecasting being more of a decision-making tool that should help us understand who is at risk, what kind of risk do such people face, how can we, for example, prepare for early actions, where are people at risk or assets at risk, where are they located, at what point do we take early actions. And the Red Cross and partners have developed a guide, which I believe will be shared with the participants. And if you'd like to know more about the impact-based forecasting guide, please, you're free to take a look at that. So in conclusion, in regards to the flood and drought forecasting within the region, that yes, we still have limited capacities, but there is some progress that is being made, and especially towards transitioning from from the current forecasting on what the weather is to to impact-based forecasting, what the weather will do. And also there quite some good progress in terms of raising the need for investment at government levels towards strengthening the National Hydromet Services in being able to achieve the vision for impact-based forecasting. Thank you. Over to you, Christophe.
Thank you, Irene. Now let's go a step further and consider some lessons learned, if you will. First, we'll hear some results of the study conducted by ODI, the Climate Center and Rumble for the OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, one of the 15 partners of Adaptation. Emily, can you tell us more about what is at stake in the Caribbean and the lessons learned so far?
Thank you. Yes, so let's go back to the Eastern Caribbean. I want to talk about the potential of forecast-based early action to improve risk governance in a region that's beset by climate shocks. So this is a very urgent issue to be dealt with. And our research suggests that that there are opportunities for using forecast-based early action as an approach to really strengthening risk governance arrangements and institutions. First, I'll provide a bit of context on why this is so important. The Eastern Caribbean islands have very high levels of public debt, so these are the kind of real economic constraints on managing climate risks. Many of them are not eligible for overseas development aid, and the impacts of COVID-19, particularly on the economy, are going to be severe. So there is very limited fiscal space, very little budget available to really address the multiple risks that these islands face. And so there's the importance of optimizing resources really is key here. And we identified two ways of doing this. One is through kind of longer term and careful land use planning to think about where infrastructure is located, to make longer term investments using regular sectoral budgets, and to strategically leverage external resources to the extent that that is possible. The second is to have really well planned and targeted actions when disasters are imminent, so when there is a forecast of impact to address these residual risks. And these actions are clearly complementary, but we're going to focus on the second, on the latter, which is the targeted actions based on forecasts as a way of really making the most kind of efficient use of limited resources that these islands have, and an area around which there's potential for strong collaboration with development partners. So what does this kind of governance context look like that needs to be that needs to be improved? Well, first of all, the national emergency management agencies, which are charged with coordinating preparedness and response to natural hazards, have very limited resources, very few resources with which they can address risks. So they develop preparedness plans, but those plans often lack specifics. They lack detail on what exactly needs to be done and when. The activities outlined in the plans have often not been fully implemented when there is when the alert level increases, and the main reason for that is that those institutions lack necessary resources, vehicles to get food items to communities before disasters, and are doing a lot of the work on their own. The preparedness is based very much on common sense and experience, less so on data of likely impacts and vulnerable groups and communities. And there is a perceived uncertainty and idea that there are trade-offs in dedicating resources to an unknown event. However, when the disaster becomes more imminent, when there is a forecast, having a good set of well-planned and funded actions with clear responsibilities for delivery could make a major difference. So there's the kind of potential for forecast-based early action it puts into focus. actions which can be implemented once there is a greater, more information about where a disaster is likely to hit. All of these kind of constraints, resource and capacity constraints, mean that a regional response is normally needed, but that is well coordinated and efficient. So there are mechanisms there at the regional level that can be built on. So there are a number of lessons and kind of next steps towards building a regional approach to forecast-based early action, which is what we think will most kind of benefit these small islands. Firstly, that there are a lot of regional initiatives, particularly around impact-based forecasting, which Irene just explained. There are lots of initiatives supporting data sharing and use of data across the region for planning investments. So this is clearly an area that can be built on and can be strengthened in terms of really understanding likely impacts when there are forecasts of extreme weather. There is interest in creating a regional fund, and the benefits of that would be to pool resources and to have greater kind of collective efficiency in the way that early action is funded and would spread the risks. It's very difficult to accurately forecast or predict which islands are going to be affected by a hurricane. So having the funds at the regional level that could be allocated in that way would be more efficient and would build very much on the sort of solidarity and integration which already exists within the Eastern Caribbean. Having a regional fund and triggering finance at the regional level can also help promote joint analysis, and triggers can be created between states. And very, very importantly, and to not sort of not affect kind of longer term investments in disaster risk reduction and preparedness, it would be important that a fund could also incentivize pre-preparedness, that there would be some mechanism or way of ensuring that governments and their partners were preparing in advance, and that would allow them to access funds for early action when there was a forecast. And my final point really is about strengthening sectoral roles. It's very clear that the disaster management agencies alone cannot be responsible and don't have the capacity to implement the kinds of action that's needed before and immediately after a disaster. It's going to be critical that other sectors form part of this sort of early action partnership, and in particular social protection as a way of delivering support to vulnerable communities, but also health, education, housing and other sectors should have early action roles within their areas of work. So overall, we can see that this, for forecast-based early action to work and to build on the kind of regional collaboration and initiatives that already exist, this needs to be a collective endeavour across humanitarian development, national risk management, and sectoral ministries, agencies, and communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. We are a little late, but we'll try to keep time for questions anyway. Irene, you and the Red Crescent Climate Center have a lot of experience about FBA, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular Uganda and Kenya. To what extent lessons learned there are similar or different to what Emily just mentioned about the Caribbean?
Thank you so much, Christophe. So I'll pick up from the last lessons learned in terms of FBA being a very collaborative process. And that, in my view, cuts across any context, cuts across any region, cuts across any country. If we are going to talk about the focus-based action, you're going to need people from the forecasting agency, you're going to need the legislators, that is government, you're going to need the finance, you're going to need, the communities, you're going to need the DRR humanitarian organizations. So there is need to have a collective conversation and engagement of all the relevant stakeholders, and that is one approach also that we've learned in Uganda and Kenya. So, for example, looking back in 2013, it was a lesson that we learned the hard way. So, for example, we had very limited engagement of the National Meteorological Agency in the development of the forecast-based system, and indeed at that time we were still using GLOFA. So when we triggered at that time, when the Red Cross triggered, we shared this information with the National Met and said, hey, we do have an indication that flooding is going to happen in a certain, in a village in eastern Uganda, can you be able to project this information? And the Met said, actually, when we look at our seasonal forecast, that area is expected to have a lot of rainfall, but we cannot use the information you're giving us because it was not processed by us, the government. So we did have good information coming through from an international model, but we could not do much with it because the government said, it's not information that we processed. So moving forward, we have decided, and the approach that we are using is that the relevant government agencies are taking a leadership role in terms of developing an FBA system. And it has its own challenges, of course, working with government, and then most of the people who are part of these processes are purely voluntary. We are not paying them. And also given that most civil servants in Africa, and again, particularly for Uganda, most of them would be paid for doing, they would want allowances and all that. So it's been quite a challenging journey, but yes, we cannot achieve FBA, especially at scale, without the engagement of the relevant stakeholders. And I will then transition to my next presentation in terms of what is currently going on, or what is government doing and other stakeholders in this arena. Of course, given the limitation of the forecasting abilities from one angle, there is still some work that is going on. So the first one, of course, is the dissemination of the early warning information, and this usually comes through the usual seasonal forecast information, and then, of course, the daily forecast. And then for those that have access to the daily forecast, this information is available. But the main challenge has been that the early warning information does not necessarily translate into action. And this is due to various reasons. Either people do not understand what the forecast information means, or they have no resources or the capacities and all those things. So that has been one of the biggest limitation. But again, the lesson that we've learned, and we've been in engagement with the National Met agencies across the region where we are actively involved in terms of trying to customize early warning information to the community, to the relevant communities. And I'm happy to note that, for example, in Uganda, when forecasts are produced, of course, where funding is available, they are translated to the local language, and then people are able to understand what this forecasting information means. So information that is not easily understood is not useful to the person that needs to take action. And then, of course, the governments have also been supporting contingency planning, especially for extreme events. And we had this vividly come through in 2007 when the Eastern region did encounter a lot of flooding within the region. So there was a concerted effort from regional levels, from the IGAD level, a lot of awareness that was presented, and countries had to develop contingency plans. But again, the challenge has been that in most cases, these contingency plans are activated too late, if at all they are activated. So we are also having the conversation, if we are having a contingency plan, can we make sure that it's a functional contingency plan? So lessons learned is, you need to have a continuous engagement with the local governments, with the central government in terms of developing functional contingency plans, and not just developing a contingency plan because it's a task that you have to do. And then, of course, there is the policy framework. Of course, some countries do have disaster management laws that have been helpful in terms of providing a legal framework for disaster risk management, and some of them do highlight the need to transition towards preparedness. But again, most countries do not have disaster management laws, and Uganda being one of them, Kenya is also one of them. Of course, currently for Uganda, there is a bill that is under processing towards developing the disaster management laws. And then also in Kenya, I think the conversation has started towards developing these laws. And again, for me, this resonates very well with the event for today, the International DRR Day, and the theme being, governance for DRR. And we all know that a legal framework plays a very critical role in terms of achieving effective DRR. So yes, governments are moving towards this. Again, the progress for this is very different across different countries, and it also depends on which actors or which influencers are pushing for this. And there's been support also towards the early warning systems. The challenge has been that these are fragmented. I will again pick up from Uganda, from Zambia, from Kenya. So most of these early warning systems are supported by non-governmental organizations. And you find that because of that, each organization defines the indicators that appear in an early warning system. And we do not have a national early warning system. So this has been a challenge, but progress, however slow, is moving towards ensuring that we do have comprehensive and national early warning systems. And in regards to, of course, challenges, particularly the big challenge, especially from government's perspective, has been the issue of limited resources. So do you plan for an event that is forecasted to happen? It may or may not happen. Or do you plan for something that you're certain is going to happen? And so having this conversation and a balance for this has been quite challenging. So I will also link this to a point a question that has been mentioned in the chat. What has been the biggest challenge? So this has been the biggest challenge, that yes, resources, even just getting a little bit of it ring-fenced for focus-based action, it's been a challenge because of the competing different priorities. But then also, I think the risk appetite for government is really very low in terms of just having money sit there and not sure whether you're going to spend it or not. And then, of course, I'd already mentioned the limited capacities. Very few national hydromet services are doing or transitioning towards impact-based forecasting, which is very relevant for focus-based action. Most of the national Met are still forecasting what the weather will be and not necessarily what it will do. And there is massive need for investment towards this. But what has been interesting, and the lesson that we've picked for us as we develop the FBF or FBF systems, has been that, can we work with what is available? So what is good enough within the national hydromet services? What focus can we start working with while we are looking at improving them? And I think this has also given motivation to the national Mets to engage, because in most cases we try and opt for an alternative, which may usually be an international model, and you'd prefer, to kind of ignore the challenges that you have at home. So the fact that we agreed to work within our limitations has been quite helpful enough. And then, of course, the competing priorities for government. Again, allow me to share an example from Uganda. So, of course, at the beginning of the year, the East African region, Uganda inclusive, was suffering from the locust. And then shortly after, we had the COVID. But interestingly, we also had floods that were happening within the region, and particularly in Uganda. And I remember reaching out to my counterpart in the government DRM agents and saying, hey, the focus are indicating there is potential flooding expected in X communities. What is the government doing? And I was clearly told, right now, priority is COVID. We will pick up the floods later, And yet, at the end of the day, we still had a massive negative impacts from flooding. And this has also been one of the biggest challenges we've had in regards to getting government on board in regards to the focus-based action. So it is not that the shift towards FBA is in question. No, all of us seem to agree that is the way to go. But getting people to act on this has been our biggest challenges, and one of them has been because of the competing priorities. And then, of course, Uganda right now, we are moving into the election periods, and what is on the table is elections and COVID. Anything less than that, does not pick attention. And then finally, one of the biggest challenge towards achieving focus-based action has been the limited or the lack of trust in the focus, especially at community level. And what we've done, or the lesson that we've learned here, is in terms of engaging communities towards co-producing focus, but then also helping them understand, as we all know that focus are not 100%. So can we understand the limitations of focus? And if an event that has been forecasted to happen has not happened, it is not an individual's fault at the Met Agency. So this is still work in progress, but we are happy that the communities we've been engaged in have been quite very interested and motivated to engage in this process. And then briefly, the Red Cross and other stakeholders are now massively looking at investing towards focus-based action or anticipatory action. So the map that I've projected here, I don't know if it is very clear to you, it's just showing a global, map where a lot of anticipatory focus-based action is ongoing by the various organizations. But I just wanted to highlight that out of over the 60 countries, the Red Cross is actively involved in 30 countries, and I believe Damien will also share some insights from Philippines in regards to anticipatory action. So work is going on. There is a lot of lobbying and advocacy towards focus-based action at national and at regional levels, and then also at community level. We are strongly mobilizing action against having those conversations. And then, of course, there is research that is going on towards the value of focus-based action. One thing that we've learned is most policymakers and or decision makers, especially at government level, want a monetary value attached to focus-based action. So some research is moving on towards that direction. I'll just skip that. And then I will end with what opportunities do we have to tap into, given the lessons we've learned, given the current limitations. We realize and recognize that the current engagement on research is quite been very helpful. So we're having institutions that are very interested in terms of supporting operational research, and particularly in terms of understanding the science of forecasting and how, for example, forecasting can be improved and how that can inform focus-based action. So we've had quite a lot of engagement. For example, for Uganda, we had good collaboration from the team of University of Reading, and the same for Kenya and Ethiopia. Then, of course, also as I'd mentioned, most policymakers are interested in the monetary value of the effectiveness of FBA, and we will be looking at research in that regards in the near future. Then, of course, I think one of the greatest opportunities we have is the current interest, both globally, regionally, and nationally, on focus-based action. Now, the challenge is, how do we tap this action and translate, how do we tap into this interest and translate it into action, So if, for example, everybody is excited, yes, FBA is the way to go, but how do we make it real? So that is an opportunity that we are navigating and trying and seeing how can we get tangible results out of that. And then, of course, I cannot emphasize anymore, picking up on what Emily talked about, collaborations and partnerships. Without it, we will not see the vision of focus-based action. Thank you, Christophe, and thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Irene, for this very vivid presentation. It was really, really interesting. I can see that Emily already answered many questions from the audience, which is great because we are really running late. But before taking new questions or relaying some of them, Elodie, you are the regional coordinator of adaptation in the Caribbean, and you coordinated this study that was conducted by ODI for the OECS. I think you have a complementary question for the German Red Cross with Damien Riquet, who could come on board if the techniques allows it.
Yeah, so good morning or good afternoon to you all. Actually, the question was for Damien, but Elena also asked the same thing regarding governments and their commitments regarding focus-based early action. So maybe Damien, you are actually in Pakistan, in the Philippines. So according to you, do national or even local governments invest in FBA mechanisms? And if not, what are the main obstacles to scaling up this type of mechanisms? If so, what are doing, for instance, the Philippines government in investing in DR and therefore in FBA? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I would not talk about the challenge, but rather the opportunities in the Philippines. I think the National Disaster Management Act, which was established in 2010, is really a good opportunity for all the different local government units in the Philippines to access funding for either preparedness or disaster response. Because of this law, which was enacted quite a long time ago, 10 years already, we were able to really advocate towards our local partners to use some of the preparedness funding as a start for focus-based action. We've been working in the Philippines with the Philippine Red Cross and with German Red Cross support for 3 years on focus-based action. And we already have 3 provincial partners who have allocated part of their preparedness fund for focus-based action, for specific focus-based action. One of the also strengths of our project in the Philippines is that we have managed to localize all the early actions for typhoon and flood, localized to the specific needs of the different provinces in the country. I think by doing this localization and also by demonstrating how it can be done in a very short lead time, we are talking about 3 days or 2 days lead time for typhoon and flood, we managed to get some buy-in from the provincial government. So those are the 2 opportunities and strengths, I think, in the Philippine context, doing the localization, the decentralizing all the intervention for focus-based intervention, and also the fact that there is funding available, not a lot, but there is funding available. And some of our partners are taking the risk to use some of their preparedness fund for focus-based action. We still need to demonstrate that it can be done. We haven't, we have demonstrated with the Red Cross how to do focus-based action in the Philippines, but we still need our government partners to use their funding, which has been set aside for focus-based action, and use that money for quick anticipatory action, which can make really a difference. So we have the money set aside from some partners in the field, from provincial partners. We need to help them now to use this money for focus-based action. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien.
Damien, sorry, Damien, do you have any cost-based benefit analysis to demonstrate, I would say, the added value of such mechanism for other governments?
Yes, that's a good question. We have very, very limited results at this stage. We managed to do a very small scale activation last year for Typhoon Tisori in December 2019. We had, unfortunately, we were not able to access the focus-based action funding of the IFRC at that time. So we got a very small funding, and it was a small-scale intervention with already some good results, showing the benefit of investing a small amount of money in anticipation to the typhoon, saving some significant fund in the repair and the recovery phase. So very, very few results, but already quite promising. So I don't expect we will be activating in the coming Northeast monsoon season. But yes, I think it's quite crucial that we can provide more evidence, more learnings from activation to get more people joining the focus-based action family. So I do expect more learnings in the future, even though I don't want to do any activation in the coming months. Thanks for your question.
Thank you very much, Elodie. Thank you, Damien. There are some questions that are interesting also in the Q&A panel. There is one that I would like to ask to Thuy-Binh Nguyen from the French Red Cross. How do you include the communities, and how do you use FBF or FBA approach for slow onset disasters such as droughts?
Well, hello everyone. Thanks a lot, Christophe, for very, very interesting questions. Well, French Red Cross is currently developing an FBF for drought in Niger with also the funding from AFD. And working with communities is one of the first steps in focus by early actions, identify the most vulnerable and also to make sure that the early actions are the most adapted to their needs. And I think this is one of the very strong advantages of focus-based actions, early actions, because normally in humanitarian response, we have to act quickly and sometimes we do not have enough time to consult with the communities. Now with the focus-based early actions, we have a time to develop and we have a time to have the consultation with them to identify the activities that's most relevant to the communities. Now, coming back to the examples of the FBF drought in Niger, actually, I think Irene has been talking a lot about drought and a lot of examples in Kenya and in Uganda. We are actually now in the very much the last stage in developing the early action protocol for the drought. And actually, we're facing quite a lot of problems or challenges. One of the things is that the drought is a slow onset disaster. Activities or early actions will need to be adapted to these slow onset disasters. According to our estimation, we will need at least 1 year for the preparation and the implementations of early actions, which not very often fallen into the funding of humanitarian funds. In addition, the drought, whenever it's happened, it will cover very large scale. It's not like one province, one communities. It would be half of the countries or several countries like in the Sahel. So how would it fit into a smart budget of a contingency budget of a development projects, or how it would fit into a humanitarian response who prefer to work more on humanity in a response phase? The third questions of the drought is that the drought is not like the rapid onset disaster where you have the D-Day, the day that you can say this is the response. There is no clear cut between early actions and early response, and it has to be a continuum of activities. And that's the reason why I think the FBF for drought is a very good example of the needs that we need to work with both development and humanitarians together. I hope I answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Thuy-Binh. Maybe we can take some time to answer a remaining question that had 4 votes from Jennifer Mvuama. Jennifer asks, how would you go about making FBA approaches more conflict sensitive in conflicts context? If we can come back to Irene and Emily for this answer, and maybe we'll close the session afterwards. It's a very tricky question.
Yeah, it is a tricky question. We have just started some work with WFP in the Arab States region to look precisely at this issue, because it's an area and a part of the world both where there are strong states and institutions, but also conflict and challenges of working that humanitarian agencies face in responding to disasters will be similar to those that they would face in acting early and on the basis of forecasts. So I think this is work that's very much in progress. But there's certainly an interest in looking at this issue and seeing kind of added value and who the relevant stakeholders are to work with in these kinds of fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So I think hopefully we can come back with a more complete answer once we've delved a bit more into the work in that region.
Irina?
Okay, thank you. I will. Yes, so thanks a lot for that. So just a quick to note that there is currently some work that is being done towards understanding flash floods and how, for example, how that can help in terms of informing meaningful action, especially given that it has a very limited time, you know, in hours, we already seen floods. And in terms of engaging communities, so the approach that we've taken is we do have, for example, FBA that is focused mainly in urban settings. And I think that there is an example in the Philippines, and then of course Uganda and Kenya also looking at FBA in the urban setting. So the process has been in terms of understanding who are the at most risk communities within the urban settings and having conversations in terms of the risks they face and the potential actions that could be taken. But one thing that we recognize is it is quite very complex working within urban areas, given that most of the challenges, especially in regards to flooding, are actually more of a structure than necessarily, you know, having a more structurally related. So it's been quite a challenge. I do not have a success story for you right now from Kenya and from Uganda and Kenya and within the region, because this is work that has just been started, but I'm hoping that in the future we should be able to share some examples. But at currently what is going on is that the engagement is going on, but we are yet to see how this will work out, especially in the context of flash flooding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are already 20 minutes late, so I think it's time to thank you all, the speakers, Elodie, Tribune, and Damien, on the audience. A final word also, thank you for the AFD Communication Department with Magali Maran, Sarah Ripon, and Antoine Favreau. It was the first webinar of Adapt Action. You will be sent the replay of this webinar alongside with specific publication about the study that we mentioned during this whole session. Thank you very much. Have a nice day and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.